Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you are ready for your next lecture. Today's going to be a little bit longer of one, mainly because there's just so much information for me to cover. Today, our topic of discussion is going to be the Crusades. So today we're going to spend the first of 2 days discussing the Crusades. Today's discussion will be largely focused on the history of the Crusades and the ideology that drives it. The next one will focus more on the long-term impacts of the Crusade, especially the consequences for Muslims and other targets or victims of the Crusades. So, to do this, we need to start by acknowledging the recent use of the language and symbolism of the term crusade. We will discuss in the next lecture some of the century-long sort of resonance of the Crusades, but I want to confront it with the past few years. In 2017, white supremacists marching in Charlottesville carried shields marked with a cross meant to look like the shields of crusaders. From using the term Deus Vult, or God wills it, a rallying cry of the Crusades, to memes of crusaders, racists and Islamophobic interests have used the image of the Crusades in modern attacks on immigrants, Muslims, and minorities. Ignoring the strange mental gymnastics of the same groups using the Crusades side by side with Norse pagan imagery, a faith the Crusaders would have considered a target, these groups evoke a crusade as a nostalgic time of ideological purity. But this is... I apologize for using this term, but this is quite frankly just pure bullshit. We will discuss a more complex, nuanced, and ultimately more accurate image of the Crusades in this lecture. There will be no unified Islam to fight, not a unified Christianity. Victims of the conflict came on all sides, and no one side, as such sides there were, came out looking like the good guys. That's an important thing to emphasize here. No one came out for the better. Everyone looks pretty bad. So, a crusade, as it really was one of a series of wars justified through religion. The most famous crusades, ones which were generally modeled after, either after their successes or to avoid future failures, took place between the 11th and the 13th centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean. To be considered a crusade, it needed to receive a form of papal sanction, that is, papal sanction, often in the form of a legate overseeing them. The Crusades varied in size greatly, from a sanction for one's nation's army to many nations or groups attempting to operate in unison. The targets of the First Crusade were the Muslims in the Levant, but ultimately Jews, Spanish Muslims, heretics, Eastern Christians, Baltic pagans, and more would find themselves the targets of this crusading violence. The term crusade comes from the crosses worn as badges and used as banners by those fighting in the Holy Land. So, this map covers some 200 years of history and some of the main crusade campaigns, those which we generally call the numbered crusades. Although they each took different routes, the terminus for the groups was here, as you can see in the orange shaded area right here, in the Levant. To Christians in medieval Europe, Palestine, and especially Jerusalem, where Jesus lived and died, was the Holy Land. Between 1095 and 1291, 9 major crusades and a steady stream of crusaders headed to the Holy Land to fight. But what started this all off? To an extent, this dates back to the 7th century. If you recall to our Islam lecture last week, Umar, the second caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate and a companion of Muhammad, captured Jerusalem in 637 as he expanded. Note that the First Crusade comes a good 450 years later, so when Crusades speak of quote-unquote retaking Jerusalem, this term is somewhat questionable. Muslims have long since made this region home, and the majority of the local population has long since converted. Yet Muslims did not drive Christians out of their holy sites. Despite taking rule of the region, Umar had no interest in destroying the holy sites of, or angering the people of the book, that is, other followers of Abrahamic faiths. This permission for Christians to visit their holy sites was maintained by both Umayyads and Abbasids, the next dynasties to rule, neither of which wanted to rock the boat. However, in the 10th century, the Fatimids, a Shiite, so the other major branch of Islam, dynasty, arose in Egypt and North Africa. They claimed to be descendants of Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. By the middle of the 10th century, they pushed the Sunni Umayyads fully out of North Africa and the Abbasids out of Egypt, setting up a capital in Cairo. They remained possibly the most influential Mediterranean power until the 12th century. The Sunni Abbasids, despite their losses, remained in their capital of Baghdad, managing a multi-faith and multicultural empire while skirmishing with the Byzantine Empire. When the Fatimids took Palestine from the Abbasids, they disliked the region's popularity as a center of faith, not their own. They ordered the destruction of all churches in Jerusalem in 1009, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Although they lost control of Jerusalem by the time of the First Crusade, and their policy was by then already not so severe, this event has a lot to do with setting the ball rolling for the Crusades. There is, however, one other important circumstance. In the mid-11th century, things get more complicated in the region. A nomadic Turkish group sweeps in. They capture Baghdad from the Abbasids and advance deep into the Byzantine Empire, taking most of Anatolia, that is modern-day Turkey, where this new group is here to stay. In 1071, they defeat the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert. 2 years later, they take Jerusalem. Over the next 2 decades, Fatimids, Abbasids, and Seljuks are at near constant war over control of the region. You can also see other arrows leading into the Byzantines here. Normans in Naples and Sicily have threatened their control over the Adriatic coast, while steppe nomads, pagans from the area of Ukraine and beyond, are threatening their borders. Despite poor relations with Latin Christianity, that is Catholic Christianity, the Byzantine Empire Alexius I, seen here on the left, sends a letter to Pope Urban II, here on the right, in a very fanciful depiction of him, asking for help in defending the empire. He expects the Pope to effectively drum up some mercenaries, which Alexius I can use to defend Christianity, as in protect the Byzantine Empire as the heir of Rome, against the specific groups on its border and retake the lands lost recently to the Turks. Instead, he got the First Crusade. So, at Clermont in France, Pope Urban II gives a sermon at presumably set moment during the speech. The crowd choruses Deus Vult, or God wills it. Clermont goes far beyond Alexius's request for help, creating an extensive justification for what they do. Take a look at what he says in your primary sources. What kinds of crimes are Muslims accused of committing? So hopefully in that pause you press the pause button and read through or reread through the source. And if you're looking back at the Council of Clermont source, you'll see what he says about Muslims. It's pretty extensive, isn't it? All sorts of atrocities: murder, desecration, human sacrifice. Urban II points to a series of reasons to go to war. First is this idea that the pilgrims are in danger and Christians are suffering, a moral imperative to take action. But while the region is torn by conflict and atrocities typically happen in warfare, Christians aren't the exclusive targets of this violence. The Seljuks have reopened the Holy Land to pilgrimage. Does Urban II not know that when he gave the speech? Or does he simply not care because it serves his purposes? And of course, are they really quote-unquote retaking a region that Christians haven't held for centuries and that Latin Christians have never held? Remember that the Eastern or Orthodox Christians, as led by the Byzantine Empire, ruled Jerusalem prior to its conquest by Muslims. In order to promote them taking action, Urban II suggests that the crusade is a path to the remission of sins. In theology of the time, sins imposed a penance that had to be accounted for, such as seen in William the Conqueror's building of churches after violent conflict. The Crusades were a path to many for repentance. Violence against the enemies of Christianity was not only justified, but made an action that could help one's soul. Although the church position was more complex, many saw service in the Crusades as a quote-unquote get-out-of-hell-free card. But there were less ethical positions on this as well. The Middle East was known to be wealthy and while few found it, many likely saw success in crusade as a path to wealth. But what more found was honor. After all, in a culture that valued both piety and martial prowess, the crusade promised to merge both ways to gain honor, both to ensure a successful campaign and to not rock the socio-political boat. Urban II does not call all Christians to action, just those with the means and strength to travel across the then-known world to wage war. Women, the poor, and anyone without their Lord's blessing need not apply, though many went nonetheless. In laying this all out, he reminds his audience of Charlemagne creating this continuity of an enemy, even though the Fatimids are a different sect of Islam from the Umayyads in Spain, and the Turks were never in Spain in the first place. But he wants a single enemy. What does he want of Christianity? Urban II proposes that Christians put down arms against each other to cooperate against this manufactured specter of an Islamic threat. Why might Urban care so much about this? Well, Western Christianity, Catholic Christianity namely, had gone through a century of change. With the growth of a more unified kingdom, or rather unified kingdoms, the Church was attempting to exert control over and through them. One goal was to standardize the liturgy. After all, in order to go to heaven, one must follow not only Christianity in general, but the proper form of Christianity. And that meant education, oversight, and control by the Pope, the highest representative of God on earth. In the process, they had gotten embroiled in the investiture conflict. Verbal conflict and pressure between Pope and Holy Roman Emperor over who ruled led to civil unrest in the empire, as the Pope's vocal criticism led many to question the emperor's right to rule. Bishops were often appointed by rulers, such as the example last time of William's half-brother becoming a bishop in Normandy. To keep the clergy loyal to the Church, the papacy sought to deny rulers the right to do this. After decades of conflict, the Church ultimately gained greater control over appointments, and this conflict played out across Western Europe over several centuries to similar effect. In addition, the popes were dealing with persistent conflict between Christians, driven by continual desire to expand realms and gain prestige. Movements such as the Peace of God were developed to try to limit this violence, lest it undermined the moral authority of a faith that claimed to follow the Prince of Peace, that is, Jesus Christ. The Crusades, the turning of violence and tension against an internal enemy rather than each other, was seen as another way to resolve these issues of recurrent violence amongst Christians. Hopefully none of that is too complex. Once again, this sort of reveals the depth to which the Crusades went simply beyond just going to war with people of a different religion. There are many aspects and sides to all of it. So, in order to muster an army for the crusade, bishops begin spreading the word. But so do many preachers, often operating outside papal control or approval. And these preachers who are outside of papal control often preach to peasant populations. Having suffered the challenges of agricultural life and the pressures of lords, many likely saw the crusade as a way out. By far, one of the most successful of such preachers was a man named Peter the Hermit, a charismatic speaker who claimed to have been appointed to preach by Christ himself. It is no surprise that the Byzantines called him Peter Cuckoo. Some 30,000 people, mostly peasants, join his banner, a force referred to as the quote-unquote People's Crusade. They begin moving towards the Middle East through Eastern Europe. Like any large army, they feed themselves on the lands they pass through, but this force is remarkably destructive, looting their way across Eastern Europe and targeting Jewish populations in particular. When they finally reach Constantinople, the Emperor, Alexius I, has no idea what to do with this force. It isn't, after all, what he asked for. He ferries them across the straits to the Middle East, warning them that they are ill-equipped to face the Seljuk forces. They totally ignore him. But of course, he is right, and they are immediately crushed by the Seljuks, with few surviving, including, of course, the firebrand Peter the Hermit. A few months later, after the Peasants' Crusade, the powerful nobles of France, Germany, and the Low Countries, that is, modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, got their act together. A second wave of crusaders, twice as large as the first, well, or at least better organized, and led by powerful nobles, swept through the Byzantine Empire into Asia Minor and down into the Holy Land. They followed various routes to Constantinople, either overland through Hungary or by sailing across the Adriatic and then through Serbian territory, and then down the coast of Asia Minor to Syria. There is no commander-in-chief, so to speak, and rivalries among the European leaders were intense and frequently bitter. Emperor Alexius quickly realized that these nobles were uncontrollable, and he tried to make them his vassals, having them ultimately try to swear oaths to him. Most of the nobles agreed that if they conquered new lands, Alexius would be their feudal lord. Alexius may have felt that he was finally getting control over things, but he would have ultimately been mistaken. By 1097, the Crusaders reached the walls of Antioch, a populous and well-defended city in Syria. From October of 1097 into the new year, they besieged the city, finally, and very under unlikely circumstances, took over the city in June of 1098. They move steadily south and take Jerusalem on July 15th, 1099. Having taken the target of the crusade, they begin to consolidate their own conquests. On Christmas Day, 1100, a French leader named Baldwin was made king of Jerusalem. Later, a Latin cleric was made bishop, replacing the local bishop, the Byzantine Greek bishop cleric. So, at first the Crusaders had indeed returned land to the Byzantine Empire as they had promised. Recent losses to the Seljuk Turks were repatriated, restoring the Byzantine control of much of the land they lost since Manzikert. But as losses mounted, they got further from Constantinople, and tensions rose with a Byzantine Empire that had little interest in aiding them, and thus their policy of returning lands changed. From Antioch onwards, the Crusaders refused to return, and again, many of these lands had been in no Christian hands for centuries, to the Byzantine territory. They brought with them the system of feudalism they knew from their own lands, establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa as the three most important Crusader states. And that's an important term to keep in mind. And although their impact on the world is great, the longest-lived one, Jerusalem, didn't see its 200-year anniversary. Collectively, these Crusader states are known as the Outre-mer, which is an old French term referring to beyond the sea. Although a steady stream of new Crusaders arrives to assist, these new states are far from the support of most of Western Europe, and the only thing keeping them from being conquered is the lack of coordinated action against them. Nevertheless, Seljuk forces retake the county of Edessa in 1144. Pope Eugenius responds with a papal bull, Quantum Praedicatores, a translation of which is in your primary source packet. First, look at who this is addressed to. Eugenius is directly looking for royal support in the hopes that this will make the crusade better organized and less prone to infighting like the first one was. Unfortunately, Christian kings have their own rivalries amongst one another and tend to bring them along on the crusade. We see an explicit mention of the fall of Edessa, but also the retreading of similar language from Urban II's speech of atrocities committed against Christians. We also see another important consideration. What is that? So, this time, the Church realizes that going on crusade is costly both to leave and dangerous for what is left behind. The Church wants to ensure that the Crusades don't come back to massive interest on debts, as well as assist in funding in the first place. The language of remission of sins is becoming more prominent and more codified, supported by the idea that the reversals in the Middle East are indicative of Christian sins at home. Eugenius is trying to improve upon crusading as an institution as a whole. Eugenius also wants to have a clear man in charge of preaching the crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Pope's former teacher, is the man selected for this task. Bernard of Clairvaux is a deeply religious man, one highly eloquent and with a reputation for miraculous cures, and an ideal representative of the crusade. He writes to princes and bishops to gain their support, presenting it as an opportunity for spiritual renewal and the forgiveness of sins. Bernard's efforts are successful, both among rulers, but also among all levels of society. Take a look at one example of a troubadour song, in which you have in your primary source packet, roughly pronounced Chevalier molt estes guarits. Traveling composers and performers, their songs represent the language, concepts, and beliefs of many of their time. You can see here one of their songs. See how these ideas of warriors with military prowess being called to turn their arms to pious service, and how their honor depends upon the holy use of their strength. You can also see a growing knowledge of the region they are attacking, with the geography of Old Testament events likened to the victories of the Crusades the Crusaders are seeking. So, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany take the lead this time for the Second Crusade. In the meantime, an English expedition sets out by sea. They end up assisting the Count of Portugal capturing Lisbon, but few continue on towards the Holy Land. And it's important to note that they captured Lisbon from then Portuguese Muslims. As the French and German armies head out, their distrust means they travel separately. The German army is largely wiped out by the Seljuks in modern-day Turkey in October 1147, with the ragged remnants finally joining the French and pushing on. With heavy losses and little to show for it, the Crusaders decide to strike at Damascus. But although it is near Outremer and Muslim, it is one of the few small states in the region that have a shaky truce with the Crusader states, since Damascus is taking something of a the enemy of my enemy is my friend approach, as are many in the region. Damascus put up a strong defense, and the Crusaders infight enough to make the siege an embarrassing failure. In response, the Seljuks used the shift towards unity caused by the Crusaders' antagonism to move on and capture the majority of the Principality of Antioch. In other words, the Second Crusade ends with Outremer in a worse position than it began. In addition, tensions with the Byzantines are only getting worse. Both sides blame each other for the reversals each is suffering. At home, Jews once again suffer, this time being blamed for not helping Christians, for specifically not being of their faith, defeat Muslims, also not of their faith, or really any more hostile to them. And a recurrent thing you will see is that Jews are almost always totally neutral in the situation that they end up in. However, that just makes them a more easy scapegoat. So, in the following decades, the Crusader states find themselves facing increasingly unified Muslim groups surrounding them. In 1174, a Kurd named Saladin becomes the Sultan of Syria. A Sunni Muslim, he united the Fatimids and the Turkish states surrounding the Crusader states. We'll speak more about him in our Second Crusade lecture, but for the moment, I will focus on his impact upon the Crusades, as it may affect the Westerners. Pushed to fight the Crusades by their raiding on his territory, he attacks the Kingdom of Jerusalem, crushing the army stationed there, specifically the Crusading army stationed there, in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, and retaking Jerusalem. In response, Gregory VIII calls for a new crusade, arguing that the loss of Jerusalem was God's judgment on Christians for their sins. The new crusade would be funded by taxes, levied disproportionately on the Jewish population of Europe, and known as the Saladin tithe. Three rulers, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the English Richard the Lionheart, and Philip II of France, are the ultimate leaders of the Third Crusade. Barbarossa dies en route to the Holy Land in Turkey, and his army for the most part dies of disease or just disperses. Philip turns back after a short time, squabbling with Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart succeeds only in taking Cyprus from the Byzantines and recapturing Acre, but his treaty with Saladin in 1192 secures Christian safe passage to Jerusalem for pilgrimage. This image is a depiction of Richard fighting Saladin, although they never actually did fight in real life. In 1198, Pope Innocent III calls for a fourth crusade. It takes several years for enough interest to be drummed up to get started. This is the first sign of how wrong the crusade will go. This time, instead of targeting Jerusalem, the Crusaders plan to attack Egypt, a more strategic plan designed to defeat Muslim power bases in the region rather than go for the ultimate target straight off the bat. Venice contracts to transport the Crusaders, but then, when too few show up to pay the cost of the ships, Venice convinces them to aid in their attack on Zara in a region known as Dalmatia in the modern-day Czech Republic. Zara is a Catholic city, and the Pope responds by excommunicating all involved. Instead of turning straight to the Holy Land, the Crusaders now continue to Constantinople, with the objective of installing a deposed Byzantine Empire back on the throne who would be more friendly to Rome. Because this occurred at the time between a split between the Latin or the Catholic and Greek Church had been formalized by mutual excommunication of each respective church, but there were still hopes of a reconciliation. They succeed at putting him on the throne, but things rapidly deteriorate as the emperor is assassinated, and in 1204, the Crusaders sack the city, looting its riches and devastating its population. They establish the short-lived Latin Empire of Constantinople and distribute land to the Venetians. From this point onward, really no crusade achieves much. The so-called Children's Crusade in 1212 was led by a child who had visions telling him to muster children to succeed where their elders had failed. Several thousand children follow him. Reaching only as far as Italy, many starve and many others are sold into slavery. The Fifth Crusade, from 1217 to 1221, reaches Egypt, but although it captures the port of Damietta, fails to capitalize it to either take Cairo, then Egypt's capital, or to retake Jerusalem. The Sixth Crusade, from 1228 to 1229, is another Egyptian campaign that ends in a treaty restoring Jerusalem to Christian rule. It is retaken 15 years later. Two further crusades are led to North Africa and Egypt, but both are utter failures. The Ninth Crusade, from 1271 to 1282, gives some support to Acre, one of the last cities under Crusader rule, but fails to advance their cause in the Holy Land or to retake Constantinople, which Byzantine Christians have retaken. In 1291, after Christians kill some Muslim merchants and refuse to make restitution, the Sultan, Khalil, decides it's time to end this and takes Acre, the final Crusader outpost in the Levant. He kills some 60,000 prisoners, and the last crusading territory is taken over and is lost to Christians. After 200 years, the only Crusader entity to remain is Cyprus, an island taken not from Muslims, but the Byzantines. It is also taken some 200 years later by the Mamluks. Although the Byzantines retake Constantinople, they never fully recover. They still have over 150 years left before their final defeat, but this is the beginning of a long, slow, and somewhat painful end. The contact and trade during these years does not end, and despite the loss of the Crusade states. The big beneficiaries are the trade cities of Italy, such as Venice and Genoa. They have no scruples selling goods, arms, and slaves across the Mediterranean to all parties, Christians and Muslims alike. A project meant to signal the unity of Christianity ultimately proves just the opposite. The failure of the papacy to lead successful crusades, especially ones without conflict between constituent rulers, helps erode their power compared to local kings. While the rhetoric of the Crusades continues to be used, it nostalgizes an effort that failed, one which, to the eyes of all on its path, meant incalculable death and destruction. Our next lecture will then focus on those who found themselves in the paths of the Crusaders, both in Europe and abroad.